good evening, and welcome back. Settle in, wherever you are. Whether you're in a car somewhere on a night highway with the radio replaced by this voice, or lying in a dark room with the ceiling becoming unfamiliar the longer you stare at it. Or maybe sitting at a kitchen table with a cup of something warm that has gone cold while you weren't paying attention. Wherever you are, I'm glad you're here. Tell me in your own way, sometime, what the night looks like from where you sit. I want to know. I always want to know. Tonight, we're going somewhere old. Older than Greece, older than Rome, older than the stories that get retold in films and repainted on the walls of restaurants that want to seem cultured. We are going to the place where writing was invented, where the wheel was invented, where the first city rose from river mud and became a kind of dream that later cities kept trying to remember. We are going to Mesopotamia, which means, if you translate it literally, the land between the rivers. And we are going to look at what the people who lived there believed about how everything began, what they believed about the gods, and what the gods believed about each other, and what happened when those beliefs collided with something darker and stranger than any of us might be comfortable with at this hour. I should say up front, Mesopotamian mythology is not a single clean tradition. It is a layered and sometimes contradictory archive that spans thousands of years, multiple languages, Sumerian, Akkadian, Babylonian, Assyrian, and dozens of city-states that rose and fell and rose again. Some of what I'm going to tell you is from tablets found in ruins. Some of it is contested. Some of it was written down once and then lost for 2,000 years and then found again by a man digging in the wrong part of a field. I'll tell you when versions conflict, and I'll tell you when something is uncertain, and I'll try not to pretend any of this is tidier than it actually is. These are not clean myths. Nothing this old is clean, but they are true in all the ways that matter. Let's begin at the beginning, the only reasonable place to start, before the sky had a name, before the earth had been separated from anything, before there was darkness or light as categories that could be distinguished from each other. There were only the waters, two kinds of water, pressed against each other, the way two sleeping bodies pressed together without quite waking, without quite acknowledging the weight of the other. There was Abzu, the freshwater deep, the male principle, the vast, sweet underground ocean that moved beneath everything, that fed the rivers before the rivers existed. And there was Tiamat, the saltwater ocean, female, primal, the surface and the chaos and the generative darkness. She was not evil. And this is something that gets lost in later tellings, something I want to be careful about here. Tiamat, at the beginning, was not evil. She was ancient. She was what there was before there was anything else to be. Their waters mingled, and from that mingling, from the place where sweet water met salt water, where the deep met the surface, where one boundary pressed against another without resolving, the gods were born. The Sumerians called this primordial intermingling, the moment when nothing became something, and they were careful about how they phrased it. They did not say the gods were created. They said the gods emerged. The distinction matters. Something that is created has a creator, has an intention behind it, has a shape that someone chose. Something that emerges has only conditions and time. It rises from the circumstances that made it possible. The first gods emerged. They arrived the way foam arrives at the shore, not because anyone wanted it, not because anyone made it, but because the water moved, and the movement was enough. The first divine pair from this emergence were Lamu and Lahamu, whose names translate roughly as the muddy ones, which is either very poetic or very literal, depending on how you read Sumerian. And I have been told I should not be too confident about my Sumerian. They were the silt and the sediment, the first deposit left by the encounter of primordial waters. After them came Ansha and Kisha, the whole sky and the whole earth, the horizon principles, the vast curving limits of what could be seen and what could be stood upon. And from Ansha and Kisha came Anu, the sky god, Lord of heaven, the first king of the divine order. And from Anu came Ea, called Enki by the Sumerians, the god of wisdom and fresh water and craftwork and magic, who would become one of the most important figures in all the mythology that followed. The gods were numerous. They were restless. They were young in the way that anything is young when it has only recently discovered that it exists. And they had all the energy and the noise that goes with that discovery. They gathered, they celebrated, they made, in the language of the tablets, a great tumult in the belly of Tiamat. They danced and shouted and built things and tore things down and generally conducted themselves the way young beings conduct themselves when no one has yet explained to them that there are rules. Abzu could not sleep. This is where it begins. Not with war, not with betrayal, not with any grand cosmic rupture, but with something almost banal, almost domestic. A father who cannot sleep because his children are too loud. Abzu complained to Tiamat. He told her the younger gods were unbearable, that their noise and their constant activity disturbed the primordial quiet, that he wanted them gone. He wanted, specifically, to destroy them. Tiamat refused. She told him, and this is in the text, this is not my interpretation, that what he was suggesting was abhorrent. She used a word that in Akkadian carries moral weight, not just personal preference. She was repelled by the idea. She was their mother. She could not. Abzu did not listen to her. He went ahead with his plan, or tried to. He gathered his vizier Mumu, his advisor, his instrument, and together they began to plot the destruction of the younger gods. What happened next is the first great act of divine violence in Mesopotamian mythology. Not the last, but the first, and in some ways the most important, because it set the pattern. Ea, the god of wisdom, who knows things before they happen, learned of Abzu's plan. The tablets say he cast his spell, that he poured sleep upon Abzu. He put the primordial deep into a slumber from which Abzu would not wake. Then he killed him. Then he built his house upon Abzu's body. He built his home, his temple, his place of power, upon the body of the murdered grandfather, upon the silence deep. And there, in that house, built on a corpse, Ea's wife Damkina gave birth to Marduk. I have been struggling with how to describe Marduk's birth, and I'm not sure I will get it right, but I'll try. The tablets use language that tries to express something almost inexpressible. A being of such brightness and such completeness that the gods who saw him could not fully process what they were seeing. He had 4 eyes, some say, so that he could see in all directions simultaneously. 4 ears. When he moved his lips, fire came out. He was tall enormously, cosmically tall, taller than any other god. And his form radiated what the text calls a fearful aura and an overpowering brightness. He was not a child in any human sense. He was a force that had arrived in the shape of a child. Ymir looked at his son and saw something unprecedented. And the tablets are explicit about this. He loved him. He loved him with the concentrated, slightly terrifying love of a parent who looks at their child and thinks, "This one will be more than me." Anu, Marduk's grandfather, gave him the 4 winds as toys. 4 winds to play with, to stir up, to direct where he chose. And Marduk played with them. He sent them swirling across the primordial waters. He sent them in spirals, and he sent them in lines, and he created, with his play, waves where there had been no waves, turbulence where there had been stillness. Tiamat was disturbed by this. The waves broke against her. The other gods, the older gods, the ones who had been quiet while Abzu plotted and had done nothing, came to her now and complained. They told her the younger gods had killed her husband. They told her she had done nothing, that she had been compliant when she should have been a mother, that now she was suffering for it. They told her it was time to act. Something in Tiamat broke or hardened or was finally persuaded. She gathered monsters. This is the part that is important to understand. She did not simply decide to fight. She created, she made. From her ancient creative power, from the same generative force that had originally produced the gods themselves, she made a new army. She made serpents with poisoned fangs and draped them in glory. She made great dragons. She made the Lamu, the storm demon. She made the Ugalu, the great lion. She made the Mushusu, the dragon snake that would become one of the most enduring symbols in all of Mesopotamian art. She made 11 kinds of monsters in total, and she gave them weapons that she had taken from her own body, and she put at their head a god named Kingu, whom she also took as her new husband, and around whose chest she hung the Tablet of Destinies. The Tablet of Destinies. We will need to remember this. The object that determines what is real, what is permanent, what has weight in the universe. Whoever holds it, holds the structure of everything. She gave it to Kingu and declared him supreme among the gods. The assembly of the younger gods heard this. They panicked. Ymir tried first. He went to face Tiamat and turned back. Anu tried and turned back. The gods were afraid in a way that they had not been afraid before, because Tiamat was not Abzu, who had been put to sleep with a spell. Tiamat was the ocean itself. Tiamat was everything that existed before existence, organized itself into categories. It was Ansha, the sky boundary, who said the name that changed things. It was Ansha who said, "Bring Marduk." They brought Marduk before the divine assembly. He came, and he was still young, relatively, cosmically young, and the gods looked at him and felt what they had felt before, the recognition of something that might be enough. Marduk told them he would fight Tiamat. He would face her, but he had a condition. His condition was this: if he won, he would be king. Not one king among others, not one god in a council of gods, but supreme. His word would be law. His decrees would not be reversed. Whatever he destroyed would remain destroyed, and whatever he created would endure. He wanted sovereignty, permanent and total, in exchange for the risk. The gods agreed. They were afraid enough to agree to anything. They set up a throne. They seated Marduk upon it. They gave him a garment, and they destroyed it with their words, and then they recreated it with their words. And the garment was destroyed and recreated and destroyed and recreated. And this was the test. If the word of the assembly had power, if the collective decree of the gods meant anything, then Marduk's kingship was real. The garment came back, the test passed, and Marduk armed himself for war. He took a net of such enormity that it encompassed the sky itself, held at his four corners by the four winds. He created new winds, the evil wind, the whirlwind, the hurricane, the fourfold wind, the sevenfold wind, the cyclone, the matchless wind. He mounted his storm chariot, drawn by 4 horses with poison in their mouths and death in their breath. He held a lightning bolt. He held a flame net. He carried his primary weapon, which some tablets describe as a spear and some as a mace. And he rode toward the place where Tiamat gathered her armies. Kingu saw him coming and faltered. The monster gods saw him and faltered. Tiamat did not falter. Tiamat opened her mouth. And in the tablets this is rendered with a kind of breathless present tense, as if the scribe's hand was shaking. She opened her mouth to swallow him, and Marduk drove in the evil wind. The wind filled her open mouth. It filled her body. She could not close her mouth. She could not close her lips. She was distended, inflated, held open by the very act of aggression she had intended to use against him. And in that moment of frozen openness, Marduk drove his spear through her heart. She fell. The great primordial ocean, the mother of the gods, the ancient chaos, fell. And then Marduk stood over her body, and he did something that is, I want to be precise here, something that is either the most practical or the most brutal thing in any creation myth I have ever encountered, and I have encountered a significant number. He cut her in half. He split her body down the middle, and from one half he made the sky, and from the other half he made the earth. He used her eyes to create the sources of the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers. He used her tail to make the Milky Way. He used her breast to make mountains. He looked at her defeated body, and he saw not a body but a building material. And he built the world out of her. This is where the world comes from, in Mesopotamian cosmology. Not from nothing. Not from the word of a transcendent creator speaking light into being. The world comes from a body. The world is made of something that used to be alive, that used to be afraid, that used to be a mother. The sky above your head was made from the split flesh of the primordial ocean. And if you find that disturbing, then I think that is an appropriate response. Let me collect the thread. We have arrived at the creation of the cosmos, which means we have arrived at the moment when structure becomes possible, when order can be imposed on what was before only the pressing together of 2 kinds of water. Marduk, victorious and newly proclaimed king, stood in the space he had made and began to organize it. He set the great gods in their stations. He assigned to each the responsibility for a domain. He laid out the year in 12 months, 3 stars per month, a total of 36 stars as fixed markers of time. He designated the lunar crescent as the way of marking days. He built the Ashara, the great house, as an imitation in heaven of what Yer had built over the body of Abzu, a house over a murdered ancestor, a palace over the primordial dead. He called the great gods together and gave them their places and their duties. And the great gods, the Anunnaki, the senior divine powers, accept their assignments with what the tablets describe as gratitude and awe. But the work was heavy. The gods did not like it. Even gods, it turns out, do not enjoy endless labor, the constant maintenance of a cosmos, the irrigation and the upkeep and the bureaucratic management of a world that requires constant attention to stay in existence. They grumbled, they refused, they burned their tools in front of Marduk's palace in what is one of the first recorded labor actions in human history, which I find either amusing or very human, or possibly both. Marduk consulted Ea, and Ea, the god of wisdom and craft, the one who built a house on a body, had a solution. He would create a new kind of being. He would take the blood of Kingu, the general of Tiamat's army, the god who had worn the tablet of destinies around his neck and had failed to protect it. He would take Kingu's blood, and from it he would fashion something new, something that could do the work the gods did not want to do, something that would maintain the cosmos, irrigate the fields, build the temples, perform the rituals, and through those rituals, feed the gods their necessary sustenance. He would make humanity. Kingu was brought before the assembly. The tablets are not sentimental about what happened to him. He was condemned. He was killed. His blood was taken. And from that blood, from the blood of a failed god, a god who had been given power he could not sustain, a god who'd been elevated and then destroyed, from that blood, Ea fashioned the first human beings. Think about what this means. Think about what the Babylonians embedded in their creation myth. They did not make humanity from clay, animated by divine breath, though that version exists in some Sumerian texts. The most prominent version makes us from blood. Divine blood, yes, but the blood of the defeated, the blood of the condemned. We carry inside us, if you believe this, the substance of a god who lost. We are made of failure, made flesh. We are the recycled material of a cosmic war, given shape and set to work. The gods were pleased. They had servants now. They could rest. And they gathered. And they spoke Marduk's name 50 times. 50 names, 50 titles, each one encapsulating an aspect of his power and his sovereignty. And the Enuma Elish, the great Babylonian creation epic, closes with this recitation of names as a kind of incantation, a way of making the new order permanent by speaking it into permanence. The world was made, the gods were arranged, humanity was put to work, and for a while, some say a long while, some say the good age lasted for generations uncounted. Things were as they were supposed to be, but nothing that is made stays as it is made. I want to talk about Gilgamesh. I want to talk about Gilgamesh because he is the figure at the center of the oldest surviving long-form narrative in human history, and because his story contains everything that Mesopotamian mythology believed about what it means to be alive and what it means to lose someone and what happens when you refuse to accept the terms of your own existence. He is also, frankly, one of the most interesting characters in any mythology I know, and I have been thinking about him longer than I usually think about any single figure before coming to speak about him, and I'm not entirely sure I can do him justice, but I'm going to try. Gilgamesh was the king of Uruk, 2/3 divine, 1/3 human, which is a strange ratio. one the text asserts without explaining how such a ratio is calculated, and his divinity expressed itself in the form of excess. He was enormous, he was powerful, he was wise, and he was, at the beginning of the story, a tyrant. He exhausted his people. He challenged young men to athletic contests that were really just demonstrations of his own unbeatable strength. He claimed a right of sexual access to women that the text describes and that readers in every era have grappled with. He was too much. The city of Uruk was full of his too muchness, and the people groaned under it. The gods heard the complaint, and the gods, specifically the goddess Aruru, who had participated in the creation of humans, decided that what Gilgamesh needed was not a punishment or a constraint, but an equal, a counterweight, someone who could absorb all that excess and reflect it back, someone who could stand beside Gilgamesh in a way that nothing else in the world could. Aruru took a piece of clay. She wet it with water, and she formed a shape, and she threw it down on the steppe, on the wild open land outside the city. And from that throwing came Enkidu. Enkidu was made of clay, like the first humans, but his body was extraordinary, covered in hair, long-haired like a woman, with the strength of the sky god Anu and the force of the war god Ninurta. He ran with the gazelles on the steppe. He drank at the water holes with the animals. He ate grass. He did not know what a city was. He did not know what a wall was. He was the wild given form. A trapper found him at a waterhole and was terrified and went to his father, and his father told him to go to Uruk and tell Gilgamesh and ask for a woman, a sacred woman of the temple, a woman who knew how to be with men, and to bring her back to the waterhole where the wild man drank. The trapper did this. Gilgamesh gave him Shamhat, a woman of the temple of Ishtar, and she went out to the steppe, and she sat by the waterhole, and she waited for Enkidu. He came, he saw her, and for 6 days and 7 nights. The tablets are specific. They are always specific about the number of days. For 6 days and 7 nights, Enkidu lay with Shamhat and learned what human contact was. He learned the shape and the warmth and the weight of another person. He learned, in other words, desire. And when the 6 days and 7 nights were over, Enkidu tried to go back to his animals, to the gazelles and the wild things he had always run with, and the animals ran away from him. He had become something else. He smelled different. He felt different. He was not yet human, but he was no longer wild, and he stood there on the steppe in that in-between condition, and the tablets say he turned around and sat at Shamhat's feet. Shamhat talked to him then. She told him about Gilgamesh. She described the king of Uruk in terms that were clearly intended to be seductive. His beauty, his power, his restlessness, the way he dreamed strange dreams. And Enkidu listened and felt something he had no word for, the pull toward a particular person he had never met. He came to Uruk. There are various traditions about how the first meeting between Gilgamesh and Enkidu went. Some say it was a fight at a threshold, a doorway, a gate, with Gilgamesh pushing and Enkidu pushing back, and neither one able to dominate the other, until they finally embraced, as though the fight had been a handshake all along, as though what you do when you meet someone as strong as you are is push at them until you can understand the quality of their resistance. Some say their meeting was predicted by Gilgamesh in a dream, a falling star, a meteorite, the people gathered around, and that Gilgamesh himself was drawn to and lifted and took to his mother Ninsun as though it were a person. Ninsun, wise, divine mother, the wild cow goddess, told him the meteorite was a companion, a friend, someone who would come to him and stand beside him and who he would love like a wife. Like a wife. The tablet's words, not mine. Whether they fought, or whether they embraced, or whether both happened in some order, Enkidu became Gilgamesh's friend, his companion, the one who accompanied him in a way that nothing and no one else ever had. Gilgamesh, who had been too much for every person around him, had found the one person who was exactly enough. They went together to the cedar forest, where the great trees grew, where the god Enlil had placed the monster Humbaba as guardian. Humbaba's roar was the flood, his mouth was fire, his breath was death. The elders of Uruk told Gilgamesh not to go. They told him Humbaba was terrible. Gilgamesh went anyway, because he had Enkidu beside him, and he believed this is important, this is key to understanding him. He believed that his own death was something he could simply decide not to accept. They traveled for days. They dreamed bad dreams along the way, and Enkidu interpreted the dreams for Gilgamesh, each time taking what was clearly an omen of danger and finding within it a thread of hope. Whether Enkidu believed his own interpretations is a question the text does not answer. The text is like that. It gives you the action and leaves the interior life for you to construct. They reached the cedar forest, and the trees were enormous, the scent of cedar overwhelming. And Humbaba appeared, and he was terrible, yes, as advertised. But he was also vulnerable in the end, because Shamash, the sun god, sent his winds, 13 winds, against Humbaba and pinned him so that he could not move, and Gilgamesh stood over him. Humbaba begged. He said, "You are the son of Uruk's own mother. You grew up in Uruk. You could free me, Gilgamesh. I would serve you. You would have the cedar forest." Enkidu said, "Kill him." The text attributes different motivations to Enkidu's urgency. Some say it was the influence of Shamash, who wanted Humbaba dead. Some say Enkidu feared that if Gilgamesh hesitated, the window would close. Gilgamesh struck. They cut off Humbaba's head. They brought down the great cedars. They made a raft and floated the wood back down the river to Uruk. The goddess Ishtar saw Gilgamesh returning, victorious, radiant from the fight, probably still flushed with the particular brightness that violence leaves on those it doesn't kill. And she wanted him. She proposed to him directly. "Be my husband," she said. "Be my bridegroom." Gilgamesh refused her. He refused her in the longest and most ill-advised speech in Mesopotamian literature. He listed her previous lovers and what had happened to them. He called her a shoe that pinches the foot of the one who wears it. He called her a fire that goes out and leaves the hearth cold. He was specific. He was thorough. He was, in retrospect, quite foolish. Ishtar went to Anu, her father, weeping. She said Gilgamesh had insulted her. She said she wanted the bull of heaven. Anu demurred. The bull of heaven, released into the world, would cause 7 years of famine. Ishtar said she had prepared stores of grain for 7 years and the people could survive it, and besides, she would smash the gates of the underworld and let the dead walk among the living if he didn't give her what she wanted. Anu gave her the bull of heaven. The bull came to Uruk, and it breathed, and the ground opened, and 300 warriors fell in. It breathed again, and more fell. It breathed a third time, and Enkidu fell. But Enkidu grabbed the bull by the horns and held it while Gilgamesh drove his sword between the neck and the horns and killed it. They cut up the bull. They offered its heart to Shamash. Ishtar stood on the walls of Uruk and wailed her fury. Enkidu tore off the bull's right thigh and threw it at her. The text renders this as though it happened quite quickly, almost casually, and I think about that sometimes. The casualness of the gesture, the way rage in that moment became almost practical. The gods met. They discussed what had happened. Humbaba killed. The bull of heaven killed. Someone had to pay. Anu said, someone among them must die. Enlil, who had set Humbaba to guard the cedar forest in the first place, said, Enkidu must die. Shamash objected. Did I not help them? Were they not fighting at my command? Enlil turned to him in anger. You traveled with them like a companion, he said. And that is the exact word used, companion, and it lands differently once you have read the whole epic. You were there with them, Enlil said to Shamash. This is what came of it. Enkidu fell sick, not in battle, not by violence, not by any weapon made of cedar or bronze. He sickened the way people sicken, slowly, in a bed, across days that turned into nights, that turned into more days. He cursed the trapper who had found him. He cursed Shaman, who had brought him into the human world. And then he took the curse back because he understood, in the way that dying people sometimes understand things, that being brought into the human world had also meant being brought to Gilgamesh. And that was, the word he uses is untranslatable, but the scholars reach for good or beautiful, and I think either is sufficient. He dreamed of the underworld. He described what he saw, the house of dust, the house of darkness, where the kings and the warriors and the priests all wore feathered garments and sat in the dark and ate dust and clay. He described the shades. He described the absence of light. He died on the 12th day. And here is the thing about Gilgamesh that makes him human, that makes him ours across 4,000 years. He refused to believe it. For days, he did not allow the body to be buried. He paced. He touched Enkidu's face. He looked at him and kept looking because looking was still a form of contact, still meant that Enkidu was there, present in some form, even a terrible one. The tablets say he touched Enkidu's heart and felt nothing. And then he covered his friend like a veil. The veiling of the dead, the gesture of acknowledgement that is also a form of denial, because the veil keeps the face just out of sight, and if the face is out of sight, then the face might still be alive. When a worm fell from Enkidu's nose, Gilgamesh accepted it. This is what the text says. When a worm fell from Enkidu's decomposing face, Gilgamesh, king of Uruk, 2/3 divine, the man who killed Humbaba and the bull of heaven, accepted that Enkidu was dead. And then he was afraid of death in a way he had never been afraid of anything. He set out to find immortality, not glory, not legacy, not the continuation of his name in stone. Literal immortality, the not dying kind. He had heard of a man named Utnapishtim who had survived a great flood and been granted eternal life by the gods and placed at the mouth of the rivers, at the edge of the world. He walked to the mountains where the sun sets. He walked through 12 leagues of darkness, through the tunnel that the sun travels beneath the earth during the night, and emerged on the other side where the trees of the gods bore gems as fruit. He found a woman sitting at the shore of the sea, an innkeeper named Siduri, a small figure, a figure who appears only briefly, but who speaks with more quiet wisdom than almost any other character in the epic. She saw Gilgamesh coming and recognized the wildness in him, the grief that looked like wildness, the desperateness that looked like wandering. And she told him something that every reader encounters, and every reader has to decide what to do with. When the gods created mankind, they allotted death to mankind, but life they retained in their own keeping. As for you, Gilgamesh, let your belly be full, make merry day and night. Of each day make a feast of rejoicing. Day and night dance and play. Let your garments be sparkling fresh, your head be washed, bathe in water. Pay heed to the little one that holds on to your hand. Let your spouse delight in your embrace, for this too is the lot of man. This is the Epicurean argument, the Stoic acceptance, the hymn to the present moment, written down, as far as we can tell, sometime around 1200 BCE in its most complete form, but drawing on material that is centuries older than that. Siduri told Gilgamesh to go home and be with the people who loved him, and eat good food and hold the hands of his children, and let that be enough. Gilgamesh did not listen. He crossed the waters of death with the help of Ur-Shanabi the ferryman, and he found Utnapishtim at the edge of the world. Utnapishtim was not what Gilgamesh expected. He was not radiant. He was not visibly divine. He was an old man who lived at the edge of the world, and he looked at Gilgamesh with something like pity and told him the truth. There is no immortality for you. The gods held an assembly, and they divided. Life for themselves, death for humanity, and the boundary is fixed. But then Utnapishtim told him his own story. Before the flood, and here we enter the layer of Mesopotamian mythology that has the most resonance with other traditions, the version that archaeologists and theologians have debated for as long as they have had tablets to read. Before the flood, Utnapishtim was a man of Shuruppak, a city on the Euphrates, who worshipped Ea, and Ea, who could not directly contradict the decision of the divine assembly to destroy humanity in a great flood, went to the wall of Utnapishtim's house and spoke to the wall. He told the wall. He said, "Wall of Shuruppak, hear me. Wall, there's going to be a flood. Wall, someone should build a boat." Utnapishtim heard through the wall. He built the boat. He built it in the exact dimensions Ea specified. A perfect cube, some translations say, 1 acre in cross-section and 1 acre in height. He loaded it with his possessions, his family, the craftsmen of his city, the animals of the field, the beasts of the steppe. He sealed the door with pitch. He went inside. The storm came. It was not a regular storm. The text describes it in language that is almost too intense to pass. The gods themselves were afraid. Even Ishtar, who had helped precipitate the disaster, wept at what was happening, wept for the people she had helped to make who were dying in the water. The flood lasted 6 days and 7 nights. That number again, always that number. And on the 7th day, the water subsided. Utnapishtim opened a window. He wept. There was no land, only water, everywhere, to every horizon. Eventually, the water receded enough that the boat rested on a mountain, Mount Nimush, and Utnapishtim sent out a dove, and the dove came back. He sent out a swallow, and the swallow came back. He sent out a raven, and the raven did not come back, because the raven found somewhere to land, and this meant the world had returned enough to be landed upon. He made offerings. The gods smelled the sweet savor of the offerings and gathered around like flies. Enlil came last and was furious that anyone had survived. And Ea told him, "It was not I who revealed the secret of the gods." Enlil softened somehow in this retelling. He touched Utnapishtim and his wife on the forehead and declared them divine, placed them at the mouth of the rivers, at the world's edge, beyond ordinary reach. This is how Utnapishtim got immortality. He was the last survivor of the world's destruction, and the gods ran out of moral consistency. He told Gilgamesh all of this, and then he told him, "There is nothing for you. The assembly will not gather again for you." But, and here, Utnapishtim's wife intervened, apparently moved by some feeling that her husband was being unnecessarily harsh. There is a plant that grows at the bottom of the sea, thorny as a rose, that restores what was lost, that makes the old man young. He could at least have that, if not the full gift. Gilgamesh tied stones to his feet and dove to the bottom of the sea and found the plant, and it cut his hands as he took it. He brought it up. He named it Man Becomes Young in Old Age. He started home. He was going to bring it back to Uruk. He was going to test it on an old man first to make sure it worked, and then he was going to eat it himself. He stopped to bathe in a cool spring. He left the plant on the bank. A serpent smelled it. The serpent came from the water and took the plant and slithered away and shed its skin as it went, as though the plant was already working, as though the youth restoring property was passing into the serpent. And this is why snakes shed their skin. This is the story the Babylonians told about why snakes renew themselves and humans do not. Gilgamesh sat down and wept. He had crossed the waters of death. He had walked through 12 leagues of darkness. He had survived the cedar forest and Ishtar's rage and the grief that had nearly eaten him. He had the plant, and he lost it to a snake while he was bathing. He wept. He went back to Uruk. He walked through the gates of his own city, and the tablets make him look up at the walls, and for the first time in this version of the story, Gilgamesh looks at the walls he has built and sees them as what they are, evidence of what a life can make, the city that will outlast him, the record scratched into the stone. Some scholars read this as consolation. Gilgamesh finds in the permanence of the city what he could not find in the immortality plant, the flood story, the wise woman at the shore. He finds that what he built will remain. Some scholars read it as devastating. The man who wanted to not die comes home and looks at architecture. I think it is both, simultaneously, the way real consolation is always both. Anyway, the death of Enkidu sits in the middle of everything I have tried to describe, and I keep returning to it because it is the hinge. It is the event around which the entire epic pivots, the moment when the mythology stops being about the nature of the cosmos and starts being about the nature of a specific man's heart. Mesopotamian mythology does this. It moves from the cosmic to the personal in ways that are sometimes jarring and sometimes feel exactly right. You start with Tiamat split in half to make the sky. You end with a man crying at a spring because a snake ate his plant. And somehow, both of these things are the same story. Let me tell you now about Inanna, or Ishtar. They're the same goddess in different languages. Inanna is the Sumerian name, Ishtar the Akkadian, and her mythology is one of the most complex and interesting in the entire tradition. She was the goddess of love and war and beauty and sex and the morning star and the evening star, and she was the daughter of the moon god Nanna and the granddaughter of Enlil, and she collected divine attributes the way other people collect grievances, and she is possibly the most powerful figure in the entire Mesopotamian pantheon, who was not technically king. Her most famous story is her descent into the underworld, the place called the Great Below, the land of no return, which was ruled by her older sister Ereshkigal. Why she went is given different explanations in different versions. Some say she went to attend the funeral rites of Ereshkigal's dead husband, the Bull of Heaven. Some say she went to expand her own power, because the underworld was the one domain she did not control, and she could not leave any domain unconquered. Some say she went for reasons the text does not explain, and which scholars have filled with many different possibilities. She went. That is what matters. At each of the 7 gates of the underworld, a gatekeeper stopped her and demanded she give up a piece of her divine regalia. The crown from her head at the first gate, the rods of lapis lazuli at the second, the strand of beads at the third, the breastplate at the fourth, the golden ring at the fifth, the measuring rod and line at the sixth, the garment of ladyship at the seventh. She entered the throne room of Ereshkigal naked, stripped of everything. Ereshkigal fixed on her the eye of death. The demons killed Inanna's body and hung it from a hook on the wall, and there it remained, a corpse on a hook, for 3 days and 3 nights. Her servant, Ninshubur, whom she had left with instructions before she descended, waited and then went to the gods for help. Enlil refused. Nanna refused. Ea did not refuse. Ea formed 2 small creatures from the dirt under his fingernail, the Kurgaru and the Kalaturu. The texts call them genderless figures, beings outside the ordinary categories. And he gave them the food of life and the water of life, and sent them to the underworld with instructions. They got in by finding Ereshkigal in distress. She was in pain, crying out with the cry of a woman in labor, or a woman who wants to give birth and cannot, the texts say, and the Kurgaru and the Kalaturu echoed her cries back to her, "Oh, your inside," when she cried, "Oh, my inside." And by this strange act of empathy or mimicry, they pleased her enough that she offered them gifts, and they asked for Inanna's body, and they sprinkled it with the food and water of life, and Inanna rose. She left the underworld, but the underworld doesn't release anyone freely. The law of the underworld is this: no one comes back without sending a substitute. Inanna came back with a retinue of demons at her heels, tasked with bringing back whoever she chose to replace her in the great below. She went to her city. She went to the courtiers and the officials and the priests who had mourned her. She did not choose any of them. She came to the apple tree where her husband Dumuzi, the shepherd god, sat, not mourning her, sitting in splendor, dressed in fine clothes, elevated in her absence. Inanna fixed on him the eye of death. She handed Dumuzi to the demons. The tablets record his terror without sentiment. He ran. He transformed himself into a gazelle trying to escape. His sister Geshtinana offered to take his place half the year so that he would only be in the underworld half the year and she the other half. This is accepted. And from this, from Inanna's descent and return and the exchange of Dumuzi and Geshtinana, the Mesopotamian tradition explained the seasons. The times of year when Dumuzi is below and the earth mourns and the cattle do not breed and the fields go dry. The times of year when he returns and the world flowers. Inanna's descent is read now in many different ways, as a narrative of ritual death and resurrection, as an allegory for the disappearance and return of the planet Venus from the sky, Inanna's celestial body, which was tracked with great precision by Babylonian astronomers, as a document of a specific Sumerian religious practice we no longer fully understand, as a story about power and what it costs. Inanna enters the underworld in full divine regalia and arrives at its center with nothing, and she still comes back. The return does not restore what was stripped away at each gate. She returns as herself, but a self that has passed through 7 strippings. This is either the story of how power is lost, or the story of what remains when power is taken away. Possibly both. Quite likely both. I need to pause here. We have come a long way from the primordial waters, and we still have a long way to go. And I want to make sure we do not rush through what remains. The temptation in a story this long and this layered is to accelerate, to start summarizing. I'm resisting that. There is a world of mythology I have not yet described, the vast apparatus of Mesopotamian religious life, the temples and the ziggurat cities, and the omen literature, and the astral theology that turned every planet into a divine body and every eclipse into a message from the gods. There are figures I have mentioned in passing who deserve more time. Enlil, the Wind Lord, who sent the flood and who chose and dethroned kings. Shamash, the sun god and lord of justice. Nanna, the moon. Ereshkigal, who sits in the dark and weeps and rules. There are minor deities and demons and half-divine figures scattered through the tablets like marginalia, each one with a function and sometimes with a story that survives only in fragments, only in pieces found in different excavations and held in different museums. Half a story in Berlin and half a story in London. The seams not quite aligning when you try to press them together. What I want to talk about now is what Mesopotamian mythology believed about the relationship between the human and the divine, not as theology, not as doctrine, but as feeling, as texture. The gods in the Mesopotamian tradition were not distant. They were not transcendent in the way that, say, the monotheistic god of later traditions was understood to be transcendent. They were not beyond experience. They were within it. Shamash traveled across the sky every day, and the shepherd in the field watched him go. Inanna was the morning star, and you could see her every morning if you rose early enough and stood in a place where the horizon was clear. The gods were visible. They were neighbors, in a sense, larger and more powerful neighbors who lived closer to the sky and who had the kind of authority that comes from being fundamentally older than everyone else, but neighbors nonetheless. You could speak to them. You could complain to them. There is a literary genre called The Lament to a Personal God, in which a human author writes a formal complaint to their divine patron, explaining that they have lived well and acted justly and yet suffer, and asking, with some measure of frustration, what exactly is the point? This is a very human thing to do. It is so human that it is almost difficult to take in from the remove of 4,000 years. The recognition that the people of ancient Mesopotamia looked at their gods and felt not just awe, but also sometimes a kind of aggrieved puzzlement. They expected the relationship to make sense. When it did not make sense, they said so. The Omen literature, which takes up an enormous portion of the surviving textual record, is also part of this. The Babylonians believed that the gods communicated through the world, through the movements of celestial bodies, through the behavior of animals, through the patterns of oil poured on water, through the livers of sacrificed sheep, through the shapes of unborn animals, through dreams. If you could read these signs correctly, you could know what was coming. Not everything, not in every detail, but enough. Enough to prepare, enough to avert disaster by the right ritual action or the right offering. This belief that the future was legible if you knew how to read it tells us something important about what Mesopotamian people feared. They feared not the known catastrophe, but the unknown one. They feared being caught unprepared, being the person who did not read the signs, who walked into the disaster that could have been avoided if only they had been paying the right kind of attention. The Omen literature is an enormous collective project of attention paying. The attempt to make the universe's communication system as clear and readable as possible, so that nothing unexpected could happen, so that the future would always announce itself in language someone already knew how to pass. The counterpart to this is the flood story, which is precisely about what happens when the future does not announce itself, or announces itself only through a wall, only to one man who happened to be listening. The flood in the Gilgamesh epic and in the earlier Sumerian flood myth of Ziusudra is a catastrophe that could not have been predicted by normal means, because it was decided in a divine assembly and kept secret. The gods chose to destroy humanity, and they told almost no one. The one who was told survived. Everyone else was swept away. The fear underneath the flood story is not, I think, the flood itself. The fear is the silence of the gods, the possibility that the gods might decide something terrible and not warn you, the possibility that no matter how carefully you attended to the world's signs, there might still be disasters that came without announcement from a level of divine decision-making to which you simply did not have access. The tablet of destinies, which Tiamat gave to Kingu and which Marduk took after he killed her, this object, this divine record of what is real and permanent, appears in several Mesopotamian texts, usually as something stolen or transferred or contested. Its significance is this: it represents the idea that there is a level of reality more fundamental than the world you can see and touch, a level at which decisions about what will happen have already been made, and the question is only whether you can access that level or whether you are subject to it without ever knowing its contents. Most humans, in the Mesopotamian understanding, are in the second category. The world is running on a script you cannot read, in a hand you do not recognize, in a language that was never yours. This is perhaps the most honest thing I can say about what makes Mesopotamian mythology feel different from other mythologies I have spent time with. There is a specific quality of anxiety at its center. Not the anxiety of a tradition that fears its gods are angry with it, though that is also present, but the anxiety of a tradition that fears its gods have made decisions without consulting it, have been deciding things for a long time, and will continue to decide without input. And the best a human being can do is try to listen very carefully and read the signs correctly and not be caught off guard. The Enuma Elish, the creation epic, was recited every year in Babylon during the New Year festival, the Akitu. The priests would read the whole text aloud in the temple of Marduk. The ceremony included a ritual humiliation of the king. The king would be stripped of his regalia, struck on the cheek, forced to kneel before the god and declare that he had not sinned, had not neglected the temple, had done everything required of him. If the king wept, this was a good sign. It meant Marduk accepted his contrition. Then the regalia was restored and the king was reinstated, and the new year could begin. This happened every year. The king of the most powerful empire in the ancient world. In his height, Babylon controlled vast territories and the wealth of a dozen former kingdoms, went into the temple once a year and allowed himself to be hit and stripped and forced to kneel, and this was understood as necessary, not as humiliation in the sense of disgrace, but as the acknowledgement that the order of things required the king to perform submission to what was larger than kingship. The mythological recitation and the ritual action were the same thing in two different registers. The story of Marduk defeating the primordial chaos was reenacted every year because the primordial chaos needed to be defeated every year. The world was not something that stayed created. Creation was an ongoing project, requiring constant ritual maintenance, requiring the right words spoken in the right order by the right people at the right time. If you missed it, the world might come undone. This is, among other things, a remarkably mature theory of entropy. Let me tell you something about what happened to all of this. The city of Nineveh, the great Assyrian capital, fell in 612 BCE to an alliance of Babylonians and Medes. The fall was devastating. The library of Ashurbanipal, which had housed tens of thousands of clay tablets, including the 12 tablets of the Epic of Gilgamesh in their most complete surviving form, was buried in the rubble and fire. Some tablets were baked accidentally by the fire and actually preserved better than they might have been otherwise, which is the kind of irony that a Mesopotamian poet would have appreciated. The tablets lay underground for 24 centuries. In the 1840s and 1850s, a British archaeologist named Austen Henry Layard excavated at Nineveh and found the library. He shipped thousands of tablets to the British Museum. They sat there for decades, being sorted and studied by a very small number of people who knew how to read cuneiform, which at that point had only recently been deciphered at all. In 1872, a museum curator named George Smith was going through tablets and found the story of the flood. He found a story that was clearly related to the biblical account of Noah, older than the biblical account, from a culture that preceded it, describing a man who built a boat at divine instruction and survived a great flood while everyone else drowned. He was so excited that by one account, he stripped off his clothes and ran around the museum. This is possibly apocryphal, but I have always hoped it is true. The discovery caused a sensation. It was the Victorian era, and the relationship between the Bible and historical evidence was a very charged topic. And here was an account of the flood that was clearly older than the book of Genesis, that matched the story in ways too specific to be coincidental, that suggested that what the Bible contained was in some form a retelling, an adaptation, of a tradition that came from the river valleys of Mesopotamia and had been carried by some route, some migration, some transmissions of story across the centuries and the centuries into the texts that would become scripture for billions of people. The Gilgamesh flood story and the Noah flood story are not identical. The details differ, the theologies differ, but the core is the same: divine decision to destroy. One righteous man warned: boat, animals, flood, mountain, birds released to test the water, offering made after survival. The overlap is too specific for coincidence, and for scholars of the Hebrew Bible, this raised questions that are still being discussed. What does it mean for a sacred narrative to be a revised version of an older story? What happens to the claim of divine uniqueness when you find the source text? Anyway, that's someone else's territory, and I'm not going to pretend I can settle it in the space we have left. What I want to say is this: the discovery of the Mesopotamian tablets was the discovery of a memory that the world had lost. The civilization of the Tigris and Euphrates valleys, the first cities, the first writing, the first recorded law code, the first star maps, the first recorded story, had fallen into such complete obscurity that for most of recorded history, the people of Europe and the Middle East knew of it only through the distorted lens of the Bible's descriptions of Babylon as a place of decadence and idolatry, and through the Greek historians' accounts of a strange ancient empire. The actual texts, the actual voices, were underground. They had been underground since before Jesus was born. They were recovered in the same century that Darwin published The Origin of Species, and Marx published the Communist Manifesto, the century that was simultaneously the most scientifically productive and the most theologically disruptive in human history. And they arrived into that context like a gift or a provocation, or possibly both. When Rainer Maria Rilke encountered Gilgamesh in the early 20th century, in one of the early German translations, he wrote letters about it. He said it was among the greatest things he had ever read. He was not alone. The early 20th century had a significant number of people encountering the Epic of Gilgamesh for the first time and recognizing in it something familiar, something they had felt without having had a name for it, the specific quality of grief that comes from losing the person you loved most in the world and not being able to accept it, and having to travel to the edges of the known world before you can come home and look at the walls and understand that this is where you live and this is what you have built, and it will have to be enough. There is a version of the flood story that is even older than the Gilgamesh version, found on what is called the Eridu Genesis, a Sumerian tablet that predates the Babylonian version by several centuries. in which the hero's name is Zeusudra, and the tablet is fragmentary and incomplete. And what we have is only a portion of what once existed. What is left includes the gods deciding on the flood, Zeusudra being warned, the flood lasting 7 days and 7 nights, and then Zeusudra opening a window in the boat and prostrating himself before the sun. The tablet breaks off. We do not know what followed in this version. We have the setup and the middle and the survival, and then the tablet says nothing more. I think about this fragmentation sometimes, not with despair, more with something like wonder. The story was told and the tablet survived, and then the tablet broke, and what remained is exactly enough to know the shape of the thing without being able to read its ending, which is perhaps the condition of everyone who comes to an old story. You get the shape, you get the middle, and you have to construct the ending yourself from what you know of human nature and divine behavior and the way that water recedes from the land and the light eventually comes back through an opened window. There is a poem in what scholars call the Descent of Ishtar tradition that is worth dwelling on. It is a short poem, almost a lyric in comparison to the long narrative epics, about the time when Ishtar was in the underworld and the world above had gone dark and silent, while the Queen of Heaven was in the great below. The bull would not mount the cow, and the ass would not mount the female ass, and the man would not impregnate the woman. The poem says this with a directness that is not prurient. It is clinical even in its listing. Because the point is not sexuality, but continuity. Life, the thing that keeps going. When Inanna was in the underworld, the world stopped continuing. The mechanism of renewal failed. The serpent did not shed its skin. The deer did not come into heat. The god Papsukal, who served Inanna, wept and came to the moon god, and the moon god came to Ea, and Ea made his 2 small emissaries and sent them down. The world needed Inanna back, not for any doctrinal reason, but for the most basic biological one. Without her, nothing new was being made. The world was running down. The world, left to itself, left without the intervention of the divine forces that kept it cycling and replenishing itself, would simply stop. This is a very Mesopotamian fear. The fear that the world might stop, that the gods might withdraw or die or be trapped somewhere or simply become absent in the way that things become absent when no one is paying attention to them, and that in that absence, the world would fail to continue. The rituals, the temple maintenance, the constant feeding of the gods with offerings and incense and song. All of this was not just piety, it was cosmological maintenance. The world kept going because people kept doing the things that kept the world going. If the rituals stopped, the world might stop. If the temples fell, the gods might leave. If the gods left, the water might not flow, and the crops might not grow, and the sky might not track correctly, and the stars might move out of the positions that had been assigned to them at the beginning of time. There is something humble in this, and something almost impossible in its responsibility, somewhere between the pride of a tradition that believed it was holding up the sky and the terror of a tradition that genuinely feared the sky might fall. Mesopotamian religious life found its particular emotional register. Its liturgies are solemn and its laments are vast and his hymns are sometimes so elaborate that they feel like attempts to please the gods through sheer surplus of language, to give so much praise that the gods could not possibly be indifferent to it. Marduk's 50 names recited at the end of the Enuma Elish. This is the same project as the hymns. Each name is a facet of his sovereignty, a different angle on the same overwhelming fact of his power, and the recitation is the work of making that power real through language. The universe is what it is, because words were spoken about it in the right order, by the right people. The king of Babylon was king because the story was told correctly in the temple on New Year's Day. The flood did not come back because the story of the flood was retold, and the gods were reminded of their promise, and the rituals were performed. The story was the armor. The armor was the story. Let me try to describe, briefly, how it felt. I am aware this is not quite something I should be attempting, the reconstruction of a feeling from 4,000 years ago, but I am going to try because I think it is the only thing that actually matters about any mythology. Not the names, not the cosmological structure, not the scholarly debates about sources and influences, but the feeling. What it felt like to look at the sky from the plains between the Tigris and the Euphrates and believe that the sky was made from the body of a mother, that the stars were placed there by a king who had killed his own grandmother to become king, that the rivers came from the eyes of the defeated, and that the rivers were the reason your crops grew and your city was possible. It must have felt like living inside an enormous thing that was alive and not entirely friendly, like being in a very large house that belongs to someone else, in which you are permitted to stay as long as you perform your duties, as long as you keep the temple swept and the offerings fresh and the hymns correct. A house that could shake if the gods argued, that could flood if the gods decided to, that would go dark if the wrong deity was in the wrong place at the wrong time. A house that you loved, that you built cities in and wrote poems in and observed the stars from and made children in, and that might at any moment, and for reasons you would not fully understand, cease to support you. It feels like, and here I am reaching for a comparison that I'm not sure is going to land quite right, but I'm going to say it anyway because I've been thinking about it and I think it's the closest I can get. It feels like living in a body, your own body, the thing you inhabit completely and trust automatically, and which nonetheless has the capacity to betray you without warning, without explanation, without the comfort of having been angry at you first. The Mesopotamians lived in the world the way you live in your body, relying on it, grateful for it, performing the maintenance rituals it required, watching it closely for signs, and knowing all along that it would eventually fail, that the maintenance was delaying, not preventing, that the world that was made from a body was going to behave the way bodies behave. It is, when I think about it that way, one of the most coherent theologies I have ever encountered. The ziggurats that the Mesopotamians built, the stepped pyramid temples that were the architectural signature of their civilization, that influenced everything from Egyptian architecture to later temple architecture across the ancient world, were built to serve a specific purpose. The temple at the top of the ziggurat was not primarily a place for human worship. It was a place for the god to live. The god was believed to actually inhabit the temple, to be present in it in some form, to need a home in the city the way the city's human inhabitants needed homes. The ziggurat was a divine residence built to human scale, scaled to something beyond human scale, rising above the plane so that the god could see from it what there was to see, so that the god would feel comfortable and would not leave. Priests performed rituals in the temple that included feeding the god, actual food, elaborate meals brought to the divine image and set before it. The image ate in some symbolic sense, and what was eaten sustained the god's presence in the city. If the rituals lapsed, if the food stopped coming, if the temple fell into disrepair, the god might leave. The god leaving was not metaphorical. It was a real possibility. It was something that happened to cities when they fell to conquest. The god left with the conqueror, or the god was carried away in the conqueror's hands, or the god simply departed because the conditions that required a divine presence had been destroyed, and there was nothing left to preside over. The lament literature, those long, mournful poems about the destruction of cities that form one of the most striking bodies of writing in the entire tradition, describes the departure of the gods before the city's fall, the gods processing out of their abandoned temples, weeping as they go, leaving the city to its fate. The gods wept. This is consistent across the tradition. The gods wept. At the flood, Ishtar wept. At the destruction of cities, the city gods wept. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, Enkidu's death causes Gilgamesh to weep, and the text describes his weeping with enough detail that you can feel the weight of it. The gods were not impervious. They were not beyond grief. Grief was the condition that connected the divine to the human, the condition that proved, in some strange way, that the gods were real enough to suffer. I want to leave you with something, or a few things. This story, like all the stories that matter, does not end cleanly, and I am not going to pretend it does. The people who built Uruk and wrote the Gilgamesh epic and developed the Omen literature and observed the stars and built the ziggurats and maintained the temples and recited the 50 names of Marduk every year in the spring. These people are gone. The cities are ruins. The languages were dead for 2,000 years and are now understood only by specialists. The temples are dust, and the divine images are in museums, and the ziggurat at Ur, the most complete surviving one, stands in what is now southern Iraq, where it has stood for 4,000 years and has been visible from passing military aircraft in the 21st century, and presumably will stand for some time yet. The story survived, not easily, not completely, not without tremendous gaps and fragmentations, and millennia of being misunderstood or simply not known. But they survived, and they arrived in our century, and they were read by Rilke and by Jorge Luis Borges and by the poet Stephanie Dalley, who produced the translation I most often return to, and they are being read right now by people in universities, and by people who are curious, and by people who found the Epic of Gilgamesh mentioned somewhere on the internet at 2 a.m. and downloaded it and sat with it until the light came back. The first line of Gilgamesh, the very first line, the opening of the epic, does not begin with a story. It begins with an invitation. It says, see the city walls. It says, look at them, examine them, It says, climb the wall of Uruk and walk along it. It says, take hold of the threshold stone. It says, look at the foundations and the brickwork and consider what it has taken to build this. And it says, the tablet box of cedar wood, find its latch of bronze, lift the lid of its secret, and take out the tablet of lapis lazuli and read it. The first act of the Epic of Gilgamesh is to tell you to read the Epic of Gilgamesh. It folds you into itself before it has begun, makes you the reader a character in the story, the person who finds the box and lifts the lid and discovers the story inscribed inside. It was written as something to be found, as something that anticipated being found after having been lost, as a message from a man and a civilization who knew, perhaps, that they would not last, and who decided to write it down anyway, because writing things down is the only form of immortality the world actually offers. This is the thing that Gilgamesh spent the whole epic trying to find, and came home without finding and found anyway, without realizing it. He wrote it down. He built the walls. He came back. And the walls are still there, and the story is still in the box, and someone still lifts the lid. The world that Marduk built from Tiamat's body has not collapsed. Not yet. The rituals are different now, and the gods are different now, and the language in which we beg the cosmos for continuity is different now. But we are still performing the maintenance. We are still looking for signs. We are still sending birds out from the window of the boat to see if there is anywhere yet to land. We are still building walls and coming home to them and looking up at them in the evening and thinking, I made this. This will last longer than I will. That will have to be enough. It is enough. It always has been. Good night, wherever you are. Pull the blanket up. Watch the ceiling become familiar again. The morning star will rise before you're ready for it. And when it does, remember that someone once called her by name, and the name was Inanna, and she went down into the dark and came back, and she wept, and the world kept going. That's all for tonight. Take care of yourselves.